He had been awake since 4:45, not because of an alarm, not because of anxiety, because 30 years of military service had rewired something deep in his body, some internal clock that refused to let him sleep past the first gray suggestion of dawn. Lieutenant General Marcus Webb swung his legs off the bed the way he always did, deliberately, both feet on the floor at the same time. A small thing. But in the Army, the small things were how you built the large ones. He moved through the darkness of his bedroom in Stafford, Virginia, without turning on a light. He knew every inch of this house. He had walked it 10,000 times. He crossed the hallway, descended the stairs, and pushed open the door to the garage where a pull-up bar waited for him in the silence. He did not count the repetitions out loud. He never had. The numbers lived in his body now, not in his mind. His shoulders and arms moved in a slow, controlled rhythm. Each pull-up deliberate. Each descent controlled the way. Everything in his life had been controlled for 3 decades. At 54 years old, Marcus Webb was not a large man in the way that people expected generals to be. He was not broad and towering. He was lean and precise the way a blade is precise. His face carried the evidence of a life lived in difficult places. Deep lines ran from the corners of his eyes. His close-cropped hair had gone almost entirely silver. But his posture, even here in a dark garage at 5 in the morning, was the posture of a man who understood that how you carry yourself tells the world everything it needs to know about who you are. He finished the pull-ups, moved to the floor, and worked through 200 sit-ups with the same quiet efficiency. No music, no podcast, just the sound of his own breathing and the distant hum of the neighborhood waking up around him. When he was done, he stood in the kitchen and made coffee, not the fast kind. He ground the beans by hand the way his grandmother had taught him when he was 8 years old in Richmond, Virginia, in a kitchen that smelled like cornbread and possibility. She had told him once that the way a man made his morning coffee said everything about how he approached the rest of his day. She meant take your time, do it right. The rushing will come. Let it come after you are ready. He had never forgotten that. He poured the coffee into a plain white mug and stood at the kitchen counter looking at the framed photograph on the shelf across the room. 41 soldiers, Fallujah 2000 look. They were standing in front of a damaged building, squinting against the Iraqi sun, half of them grinning despite the exhaustion that was visible in every line of their faces. Marcus was in the center, younger, thinner, his uniform dusty, his arm around a sergeant named Dominique Carter, who was now his aide, and who was probably already at the Pentagon double-checking the briefing materials. 41 soldiers had gone into that operation. 41 had come out. Not every commander could say that. Marcus Webb could. And he thought about it every single morning, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what the weight of command actually meant. Every decision had faces attached to it. Every call had consequences measured in human lives. You did not get to forget that. You were not supposed to forget that. He finished the coffee, rinsed the mug, and went upstairs to put on his uniform. This was the part of the morning that still moved him even after all these years. The Army service uniform hung on the back of the closet door where he had placed it the night before. He had checked every element before going to bed. The ribbons were aligned. The stars were positioned correctly on each shoulder. The name tape read Webb in bold block letters. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. He dressed slowly and with complete attention. First the shirt, then the trousers, then the jacket. He straightened the ribbons across his chest, each one a compressed story, a record of places and decisions and moments that civilians would never fully understand, but that every soldier recognized at a glance. The Bronze Star, the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit with 3 oak leaf clusters, 2 combat deployment ribbons. The ribbons kept going row after row, a biography written in colored fabric and metal. He looked at himself in the mirror for exactly 3 seconds. not out of vanity, out of respect, for the uniform, for what it represented, for the men and women who had worn it before him and the ones who would wear it after. Then he picked up his briefcase, which contained classified documents he had spent 2 weeks preparing, and he walked downstairs and out the front door into the pale Virginia morning. Today was not a routine day. Today, a classified Joint Chiefs briefing was scheduled at the Pentagon on troop redeployment strategy. The Secretary of Defense would be present. 4-star generals would be in that room. Marcus Webb had been assigned to lead the opening analysis, and he had prepared with the same obsessive precision he brought to every assignment. He knew the numbers cold. He knew the questions that would come. He was ready. He pulled out of his driveway at 6:45. The drive from Stafford to the Pentagon was normally about 45 minutes, depending on traffic on I-95. He had built in an extra 30 minutes of buffer. He was never late. He had not been late to a single professional obligation in 11 years. He did not think of it as discipline. He thought of it as basic respect for other people's time. The morning was cool and clear. October in Northern Virginia had a quality he had always loved, that particular shade of light that came with autumn gold and slanted, making even ordinary things look significant. He drove south on Route 1, the long commercial stretch that ran parallel to I-95 because the interstate had shown construction delays on his phone's map and Route 1 would save him 10 minutes. I was thinking about the briefing, about the opening slide, about the question the Secretary would almost certainly ask about logistics capacity in the Pacific Theater. He was running through his answer in his mind, refining it the way he always did in the car, using the drive as a final rehearsal. I was not thinking about the Shell station coming up on his right. He almost passed it, but the fuel gauge was sitting just below a quarter tank, and the next 20 miles of Route 1 had fewer options, and his briefcase held materials too sensitive to risk being stranded on the side of the road. He signaled and pulled in. Pump 7 was open. He pulled forward, shut off the engine, got out, and swiped his government-issued credit card. He stood at the pump and looked at his phone while the fuel ran. I was reading the final email from his aide, Sergeant First Class Carter, confirming the briefing room number and the parking situation at the Pentagon. He did not notice the patrol vehicle that turned slowly into the lot. He did not notice it because there was nothing to notice. He was a United States Army lieutenant general in uniform at a gas station during rush hour. He was doing nothing illegal, nothing suspicious, nothing that should have attracted any attention at all. 3 miles north, Officer Derek Holt had been in a mood since before his shift started. I was 31 years old, white, with 6 years on the Loudoun County Sheriff's Department, and he had a way of carrying himself in his patrol vehicle that suggested he was not so much protecting the public as he was managing it. His jaw was always slightly tight. His eyes moved quickly and with a particular kind of suspicion that he would have described as sharp instincts, and that his personnel file described in rather different terms. 9 use of force complaints in 6 years. 7 of them involved black men. All 9 had been dismissed or quietly settled by the union, the way a family sweeps broken glass under the rug and tells itself the floor is clean. His supervisor, Lieutenant Raymond Garrett, had flagged Holt's file twice, had written recommendations for additional training, had requested a review of his patrol patterns. None of it had gone anywhere. The department had a way of protecting its own that had less to do with merit than with momentum. Riding in the passenger seat was Officer Sean Paulson, 24 years old, 6 months out of the academy. Still in that early period of his career when everything felt more complicated than the training had suggested it would be. Paulson had been quiet for most of the shift. Not because he was comfortable, because he was still figuring out where the lines were, and Holt had a way of making the lines seem like suggestions. Holt was driving slowly down Route 1, running through his own internal monologue the way he did on most shifts. a rolling commentary on everything he observed that he filed under the category of things that seemed off. He spotted the Shell station on the right. He spotted the man at Pump 7. Black man, military uniform, alone. Something in Holt's gut tightened. He could not have explained it in terms that would have survived a 30-second examination. He would have said it was instinct. He would have said it was experience. He would have said there was something that just did not add up, though if pressed he could not have named the specific arithmetic. A black man in a military uniform at a gas station. That was the equation. That was the something that did not add up. Not the gas station, not the morning hour, not any behavior he had witnessed. Just the man, just the uniform. Just the combination of those two things in a mind that had already decided somewhere below conscious reasoning that they did not belong together. He turned into the lot. Paulson looked up from his phone. "What are we doing?" Holt said he wanted to check something. Paulson looked at the man at the pump, looked at the uniform, looked back at his phone, and said nothing. That silence was a decision. He would understand that later. In the months that followed, he would understand it very clearly. But in the moment, it felt like the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance has a gravity all its own. Marcus looked up from his phone when the patrol vehicle pulled alongside him. He registered the vehicle. He registered the officer getting out. He noted the posture, the pace, the way the hand drifted toward the belt. He had spent 30 years reading people in high-stress environments. He had debriefed intelligence assets. He had sat across tables from men who wanted him dead and negotiated anyway. He read people the way some men read weather, not with effort, but with a practiced, involuntary precision that had become part of how he moved through the world. He knew what was coming before the officer said a word. The officer stopped about 4 feet away and looked Marcus up and down with the particular expression of a man who has already reached a conclusion and is now simply building a case to support it. "That uniform does not look right." Marcus held very still. Not because he was afraid, because he was experienced, because he understood that in this kind of moment, every movement, every tone, every word was going to be interpreted through a lens that was not going to give him the benefit of the doubt. He kept his voice level and measured, identified himself. "Lieutenant General Marcus Webb, United States Army." The officer's response was a short, dismissive sound. A laugh that had no warmth in it. He said he was sure that was true. Marcus felt the familiar weight of it settle over him. He had felt it before. Not always this overtly. Sometimes it was subtler. A pause before a salute. A slight hesitation before the "yes, sir." A look that lasted half a second too long before professional training pushed it back down. But he had felt it. Every black officer of his rank had felt it. The moment when someone looked at everything you had built and decided the math did not add up. He pulled out his military ID card. The Common Access Card standard issue for all Department of Defense personnel. It carried his photograph, his name, his rank, his social security number, and his security clearance level. It was embedded with a microchip. It was not something you could fake easily or cheaply. He held it out. The officer took it. Looked at it for perhaps 5 seconds. Looked at Marcus. Looked back at the card. Then said it looked fake. Marcus kept his expression neutral. I explained what the card was. A DoD Common Access Card. Multiple security features. An embedded chip. Biometric data. The officer handed it back and asked for his real name. Marcus told him again. The officer's posture shifted slightly forward into the space between them, a deliberate compression of the distance that was meant to communicate something about who held authority in this interaction. He asked where Marcus had gotten the uniform. Marcus told him. Issued by the United States Army. His uniform, his rank, his service. The officer said he was going to verify everything at the station after he made an arrest. Marcus's heart rate did not spike. He had been in firefights. He had taken incoming fire on 3 separate occasions in 2 different countries. His pulse had learned long ago that panic was a luxury he could not afford. but something cold moved through him. Something that was not fear, but was adjacent to it. The particular chill of being seen clearly and treated as though you are invisible at the same time. He told the officer he was making a serious mistake. He offered 3 specific paths out of this moment. Call Fort Myer. Call the Pentagon duty officer. Run the DoD database badge number, which he recited from memory. The officer refused each one, not because he didn't hear them, because he had already decided. He called for backup, identifying the situation as an uncooperative subject. Marcus stood completely still and looked at the officer and said nothing. There was nothing left to say that he had not already said. Around them, people had stopped. A man who had been checking his tire pressure straightened up and stared. A woman pushing a stroller paused on the sidewalk adjacent to the lot. A teenager on a bicycle had stopped at the lot entrance and was holding up his phone. The retired mail carrier, who had been inside the station paying for his coffee, came out, saw what was happening, and raised his phone as well. 3 cameras, 4 counting the station's exterior security system. None of it mattered to Holt. A second patrol vehicle arrived within 4 minutes. Deputy Karen Sloan stepped out. She was mid-30s, experienced, and when she walked toward the pump and got her first clear look at Marcus Webb, something crossed her face. She looked at the ribbons. She had been in the National Guard for 6 years before joining law enforcement. She knew what those ribbons meant. She knew what the arrangement meant. She knew what the stars on his shoulders meant. And she looked away. She did not say anything. She moved to stand beside Holt, and her silence became a wall that Marcus Webb was now standing on the wrong side of. A third officer, Paulson, stayed near the patrol vehicle. His hands were in his pockets. He was looking at the ground. Holt told Marcus to turn around. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. He said his name one more time, his rank, his command, his destination. The consequences that were accumulating with every second Holt continued down this road. I was not pleading. He was filing a record. He was making sure that later, when this moment was examined, there would be no ambiguity about the fact that he had given every possible opportunity for this to stop. Holt told him it was the last time he was asking. Marcus turned around. He placed his hands behind his back. He stood perfectly straight. Because even now, even in this, he was not going to let this man take his posture from him. The handcuffs closed around his wrists. The woman with the stroller made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. The kind that escapes before you can decide to make it. Someone in the growing crowd said clearly that those ribbons were real, that anyone who knew anything could see it. Holt was not listening to the crowd. He guided Marcus toward the patrol vehicle, one hand on Marcus's arm, and Marcus moved with him because he understood that the fight was not here. The fight was never here. The fight was later in rooms with better light, with evidence and witnesses, and the full weight of what he had built over 30 years, standing behind him like a formation. He ducked into the back of the vehicle. The door closed. Through the partition glass, he could see Pump 7. His government-issue SUV was still there, driver's door still open, engine still running, the fuel nozzle still in the tank. A general, in handcuffs, in the back of a patrol car, on a Tuesday morning, on his way to brief the Secretary of Defense. He closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened them and began thinking about what came next. The Loudoun County substation was a low brick building off a secondary road, the kind of building that looks like it was designed to be forgettable. Marcus was walked through the side entrance past a row of lockers and into the booking area. The desk sergeant was a man named Harold Greer, mid-50s, heavy-set with the look of someone who had processed enough people in enough years to have developed a professional distance from the parade of humanity that moved through his station. He looked up when Marcus came in. He looked at the uniform, at the ribbons, at the stars, and his expression shifted into something that was not quite suspicion and not quite recognition, but was somewhere uncomfortable in between. Holt explained the situation. Stolen valor, female subject, fake ID. Marcus corrected the error without inflection. He was a lieutenant general. The ID was genuine. He had offered 3 methods of verification. All had been refused. Greer looked at Holt. Holt said to process him. Greer hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then the institutional habit took over the deeply ingrained practice of backing your officer, of trusting the judgment of the person who made the stop, of not making things complicated in the booking area. He reached for his clipboard. The booking process was thorough and impersonal. Photographs from 3 angles. Fingerprints all 10. Personal property inventory 1. Briefcase containing classified documents. 1 government-issue cell phone. 1 set of keys. 1 military ID card. 1 wallet. Each item was logged and bagged. The booking officer asked his name. Marcus told him. The booking officer asked for his real name. Marcus repeated it without changing his tone. The booking officer wrote claims military service. I was escorted down a short hallway and placed in a holding cell at the far end. 8 feet by 10 feet. Concrete bench along one wall. Toilet without a seat in the corner. Fluorescent light overhead that hummed at a frequency designed, it seemed, to make thought difficult. The door closed, the lock engaged. Marcus Webb, Lieutenant General, United States Army, sat down on the concrete bench and straightened his back and looked at the wall across from him. The wall had nothing to offer. He looked anyway. He checked the clock visible through the bars at the end of the corridor. 8:03. The briefing was scheduled for 9. His aide Sergeant First Class Dominique Carter would have arrived at the Pentagon by now, would be setting up the materials, would be expecting a call confirming Marcus's parking. When the call did not come, Carter would try to reach him. When the calls went to voicemail, Carter would not panic. Carter had worked with Marcus for 3 years and knew that Marcus Webb did not panic and did not therefore inspire panic in others. But Carter was also thorough. Carter was precise. Carter was in every professional quality that mattered the product of training under Marcus Webb, and Carter would not wait long before escalating. Marcus knew this. He sat on the concrete bench in a holding cell in his dress uniform, and he let himself feel for just a moment the full weight of what was happening, not the injustice of it. He would address the injustice through proper channels, methodically, completely, but the feeling of it, the feeling of being seen and not seen at the same time, of wearing 30 years on your chest and having a man look at it and decide it was a costume, of having given everything. Fallujah, Kandahar. 20 years of separation from his family during deployment's holidays, missed birthdays called in from satellite phones in places where the connection kept cutting out and having all of it compressed in someone's mind into a suspicion. He let himself feel it. Then he set it aside, not away. He did not have the luxury of pretending it did not exist. He set it aside the way you set aside your pack before a climb, knowing you will need to pick it back up but not needing to carry it every second. He looked at the clock. 8:11. He waited. At 8:18, Sergeant First Class Dominique Carter was standing in the corridor outside the Pentagon briefing room, holding a phone to his ear for the 4th time in 7 minutes. Voicemail. Carter had been Marcus Webb's aide for 3 years. In 3 years, he had never once failed to reach Marcus Webb when Marcus Webb was on his way somewhere. Marcus Webb did not go unreachable. It was not a personality trait. It was a standard. Carter walked to the end of the corridor and called Fort Myer, identified himself, and asked if anyone had heard from General Webb that morning. The duty officer said the general had left at 0700 hours as scheduled and had not checked in since departure. Carter thanked him, ended the call, and stood very still for a moment. Then he walked to the Pentagon duty officer station, identified himself. He explained the situation. He used specific language. A lieutenant general is currently unreachable and did not arrive at a scheduled Joint Chiefs briefing. The duty officer's expression changed. I'm at a call. Within 6 minutes, 2 things happened simultaneously. Military police began tracing Marcus Webb's government-issue phone, and Captain Adrian Cole MP was notified. Cole had served under Marcus Webb in Kandahar in 2011. She had been a lieutenant then. He had been a colonel. She had watched him make decisions under fire that she still thought about when she needed to remind herself what calm leadership actually looked like in the worst moments. When she was told that General Webb was unreachable and possibly in distress, she did not move at a measured pace. She moved at the pace of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. The phone trace came back in 8 minutes. Webb's government phone was pinging from the Loudoun County Sheriff's substation. Cole stared at the location for 2 full seconds. Then she picked up the phone and called the substation directly. Desk Sergeant Harold Greer answered. Cole identified herself. She gave her rank, her station, and her clearance. She said she understood the substation was currently holding a man who claimed to be a lieutenant general. Greer said they had a man in custody who claimed military affiliation, yes. Cole's voice went very quiet. She said she wanted Greer to pull up the DoD personnel database. She gave him the badge number. She asked him to run it while she was on the line. Greer pulled up the database, typed in the number. The screen loaded. He looked at the photograph first. It matched the face of the man currently sitting in his holding cell. Then he looked at the name. Then he looked at the rank. The sound he made was not a word. Cole heard it. She said, "So you have him?" Greer said yes. She said, "Get Officer Holt. Bring him to that computer. Make him read the rank out loud." Greer walked to Holt's desk. He picked up the printed profile which had loaded and printed automatically, and he set it down in front of Holt and pointed at the top line. Holt looked at it. His face did something complicated. It moved through disbelief, the genuine kind, the kind that comes before the brain catches up. Then it moved through calculation, the reflexive attempt to find an explanation that did not require him to be wrong. Then it moved through something that had no clean name, the particular combination of fear and exposure that arrives when a man realizes that the wall he thought he was standing behind does not exist. Greer said, "Read it." Holt looked at him. Greer said it again, out loud, his rank. Holt looked at the paper. His voice when it came was barely above a whisper. "Lieutenant General," Greer said. "How many stars?" Holt said 3. Greer said, "How many years of service?" Holt said 30. And then Greer said the thing that would live in Holt's memory for every remaining year of his life. He said, "And you put him in handcuffs." He did not say it with heat. He did not say it with contempt. He said it the way you state a fact that has no defense and requires none. Then he took Holt by the arm and walked him down the corridor to the holding cell at the far end. Marcus Webb was sitting on the concrete bench. His posture had not changed. His ribbons were still aligned. The stars on his shoulders caught the fluorescent light. He looked like what he was. He had always looked like what he was. Greer stopped Holt in front of the cell door. Marcus looked at Holt, not with anger. Anger would have given Holt something to push against. What Marcus Webb gave him instead was clarity. The clear, level gaze of a man who has seen worse than this and knows exactly what he is looking at. Holt opened his mouth. He said there had been a misunderstanding. Marcus said yes, there has. He said they were releasing him immediately, that he was sorry. Marcus said sorry does not fix this, Officer Holt. He said they should have verified. He said he never should have arrested him. And Marcus said, "You should have believed me. I told you who I was. I showed you my identification. I offered you 3 separate ways to confirm everything I told you. You chose not to." He paused, and then he said, "You looked at a black man in a uniform and decided I must have stolen it. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a decision." Holt had no answer. There was no answer. Greer unlocked the cell. 4 minutes later, Captain Adrienne Cole walked into the Loudoun County substation with 3 military police soldiers behind her. She moved through this front room without stopping. The officers in the booking area stepped back without being told. She came around the corner and saw Marcus Webb standing in the corridor, rubbing his wrists where the handcuffs had been his briefcase in one hand. She stopped. She came to attention, and she saluted. Clean, sharp, full. The way you salute a superior officer. Not as a formality, as a statement. Marcus returned it. Cole said, "General, we're here to escort you, sir." Marcus nodded and said, "Thank you, Captain. I have a briefing to get to." She turned to face Sergeant Greer and Officer Holt and Deputy Sloan. who were all standing in the booking area in various stages of a reckoning. She said, "Who authorized the arrest of a general officer?" Holt said his name. Cole looked at him for a moment. She said, "You served in the National Guard." Holt said, "Yes, 2 years specialist." She said, "Then you should have recognized a general's uniform. You should have known to verify through military channels. You should have known what those ribbons meant. Instead, you handcuffed a superior officer. That is not just a civil rights violation, Officer Holt. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, as a member of the Individual Ready Reserve, you are still subject to military law, and what you did today is a court-martial offense." The color drained out of Holt's face. He said he was not active duty. He said the IRR was not the same thing. Cole said, "Call a JAG attorney. Ask them." Then she turned back to Marcus and said they were ready when he was. Marcus picked up his briefcase. He walked through this booking area without looking at Holt. He passed the desk where his property had been logged. He passed the photographs that had been taken of him. He walked through the side door and into the October morning. Outside it was not quiet. 3 news cameras were set up at the edge of the lot. A cluster of reporters stood with microphones. 2 of them were already on live feeds. Someone at the gas station had uploaded the footage while Marcus was being processed. It had been shared 4,000 times before he finished his coffee that morning. It was on 3 local stations within the hour. A reporter called out his rank, asked if it was true he had been arrested. Cole moved to position herself between Marcus and the cameras. He waved her off gently. He set down his briefcase. He stood at the top of the steps. He looked at the cameras and he said he would make one statement. He said, "This morning, while in uniform on my way to a scheduled meeting at the Pentagon, I was arrested by Loudoun County Sheriff's Department officers for alleged stolen valor. I spent over an hour in handcuffs and in a holding cell because Officer Holt could not accept that a black man could be a lieutenant general in the United States Army. I showed him my identification. I explained who I was. I offered to let him verify my identity through 3 separate official channels. He refused. He arrested me instead." He paused. He said, "This is not only my story. This is the story of black service members across this country who have been questioned, doubted, and disrespected simply because some people cannot imagine us in positions of authority. I will be pursuing every available remedy, military and civilian, to ensure accountability and to ensure this does not happen again." He picked up his briefcase. "I got into the MP vehicle. I was driven to the Pentagon. I was 43 minutes late for the briefing, the first time in 11 years. When he walked into the room, the Secretary of Defense stood up, and then everyone else in the room stood up. Generals and admirals, men and women who had seen everything this world had to offer, rising without being asked, because sometimes a gesture is the only language adequate to a moment." Marcus Webb set his briefcase on the table. He said he apologized for the delay. He said he was ready to begin, and he began. The video was everywhere by noon. Multiple angles, multiple witnesses, a retired mail carrier, a young mother, a teenager on a bicycle, all of them capturing the same essential sequence. A black man in a military uniform, decorated beyond any reasonable ambiguity, calmly identifying himself, calmly offering verification, calmly complying and being handcuffed anyway. The audio was clear. The morning light was unforgiving. There was nothing to interpret. There was only what happened. The hashtag appeared within 2 hours and climbed steadily through the afternoon until it sat at the top of the trending lists and did not move from there for 4 days. The Pentagon released a statement at 2 in the afternoon. "The Department of Defense is aware of the incident involving Lieutenant General Marcus Webb and is deeply disturbed by the treatment of one of our most decorated and distinguished officers. General Webb has served this nation with honor for 30 years. The disrespect shown to him today is unacceptable. Accountability will be pursued through every available channel." Veterans organizations responded within hours. One statement from a major veterans group said simply, "You do not handcuff a general. Full stop. We will be watching what happens next. Civil rights organizations released statements before 3 o'clock. Members of Congress called for investigations before 4. By 5 in the afternoon, officers Holt, Sloan, and Paulson had been suspended with pay pending an internal investigation. The sheriff's department held a press conference at 5:30. The sheriff said the right words. He expressed regret. He said the matter was being taken seriously. He said his department was committed to accountability. The public was not satisfied. The public had watched the video. And then, in the evening coverage, a detail emerged that changed the nature of the story entirely. A reporter had pulled Derek Holt's service record. Holt had served 2 years in the Army National Guard. He had separated in 2018. But his status in the Individual Ready Reserve had never been formally terminated. On paper at this moment, Derek Holt was still subject to military law. The Uniform Code of Military Justice. Article 89. Disrespect toward a superior commissioned officer. The reporters who understood what that meant said so. The ones who did not understand it called JAG attorneys who explained it on camera. By 11 o'clock that night, the story had shifted from a story about a police department's failure to something larger, something with teeth. Because if Derek Holt was still in the IRR, the military did not need the county to do anything. The military could act on its own. The Army convened a court-martial hearing at Fort Myer, Virginia, 6 weeks after the incident. The hearing room was a precise, unforgiving space. Long table for the 5-officer panel. A gallery that held on this particular morning more people than it was designed for. Media representatives seated in the press section. Observers from 3 veterans organizations. And in the front row of the gallery, in full-dress uniform, 3 silver stars on each shoulder, every decoration present and correctly positioned, Lieutenant General Marcus Webb. He did not look at Holt when Holt entered. He looked at the front of the room. He sat with his back straight and his hands folded in his lap, and he did not move. Derek Holt looked pale. His civilian attorney was a man named Gregory Faust, who had experience in law enforcement defense, but had never handled a court-martial proceeding. The union had declined to fund military legal representation on the grounds that this was not a departmental matter. Holt sat at the defense table and did not look at Webb. Major Teresa Banks JAG stood at the front of the room. She was 42, black, with 15 years of experience prosecuting cases under military law. She wore her uniform with the same precision that Marcus Webb wore his. She had a way of speaking in a courtroom that was perfectly calibrated, never too fast, never too slow. Each word placed where it needed to be and allowed to do its work before the next one arrived. She said, "Members of the panel, this case is not complicated." She said former Specialist Holt, while still subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice as a member of the Individual Ready Reserve, detained, handcuffed, and imprisoned Lieutenant General Marcus Webb. He did this despite General Webb identifying himself clearly and repeatedly. Despite General Webb presenting his military identification. Despite General Webb offering 3 separate official verification methods. Holt refused every one of them. He disrespected a superior commissioned officer. He humiliated a decorated combat veteran. And he did it because he could not accept that the man in front of him had earned what he was wearing. She paused. This is not only a civil rights violation, though it is certainly that. This is a violation of military law. This is conduct unbecoming. This is disrespect of the highest order under Article 89 and Article 133 of the UCMJ. The evidence will make this clear beyond any reasonable doubt. The prosecution called its first witnesses. The retired mail carrier, whose name was Gerald Parks, testified that he had been at the Shell station that morning and had watched the entire encounter. He said Webb had been calm throughout. He said Webb had shown his ID. He said Webb had offered to let the officer call the Pentagon. He said Holt had refused everything and proceeded to the handcuffs. The young mother, whose name was Patricia Owens, testified to the same sequence of events with the same essential conclusion. The teenager, whose name was James Sutton, had uploaded the original footage. He testified about what he had seen and identified the footage as his own. Then the prosecution called Harold Greer. Greer sat in the witness chair and looked straight ahead and answered every question with the flat precision of a man who understood that he was in this moment partially testifying against himself. He confirmed that Holt had brought Webb in claiming stolen valor. He confirmed that Webb had identified himself clearly. He confirmed that Holt had the badge number available to him before booking. He confirmed that Holt had chosen not to run it. He confirmed that when he himself had run it, the result had been immediate and unambiguous. Major Banks asked him what he had done when the result came back. Greer said he had printed the profile and taken it to Holt's desk. She asked what happened next. Greer said he had taken Holt to the holding cell. He had made Holt read the rank aloud. She asked why. Greer was quiet for a moment. Then he said because he needed to hear himself say it. The defense objected. The presiding colonel overruled. Then came Deputy Karen Sloan testifying under immunity. She confirmed that she had arrived at the Shell station and seen Webb. She confirmed that she had looked at his ribbons. She confirmed that she had recognized them as authentic. Major Banks asked her directly, "Did you believe at that moment that the man at the pump was who he said he was?" Sloan was quiet. Then she said yes. Major Banks said, "And you said nothing?" Sloan said no. Major Banks said, "Why not?" Sloan looked at her hands. She said because contradicting Holt in the field felt like the wrong call. The room was very quiet. Major Banks let it stay quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It felt like the wrong call to stop the wrongful arrest of a 3-star general." Sloan did not answer. She did not need to. The prosecution's final exhibit was Holt's body camera footage. The technician set up the playback. The room watched the screen. Webb at the pump. Webb presenting his ID. Webb offering verification. Webb compliant, calm, articulate. And then, during the moment when Webb had stated his rank for the second time, the audio captured something that had not been part of any earlier news report. Holt's voice clear and unambiguous. "Men like you don't make Lieutenant General." The room went completely still. The 5 officers on the panel looked at the screen. Then they looked at Holt. Holt was looking at the table. Major Banks said nothing for a long moment. Then she said no further questions. The defense tried. Gregory Faust argued reasonable suspicion. He argued that stolen valor cases were real and documented and that Holt was acting on legitimate concern. He argued good faith. He argued honest mistake. The panel watched him with expressions that gave him very little. Then Major Banks called Marcus Webb. He walked to the witness chair with the same posture he had maintained in the holding cell in the booking room at the top of the station steps. He sat down. He looked at Major Banks. She asked him to describe the events of the morning. I did, without notes, without visible emotion. With the precision of a man who had debriefed after combat operations and understood that clarity of account was itself a form of respect for the truth. He described the stop, the ID, the offered verifications, the refusals, the handcuffs, the booking, the cell. He described each element once. He did not editorialize. He did not amplify. He let the facts carry their own weight. Major Banks asked him why he believed Holt had refused to verify his identity. The defense objected. Calls for speculation. The presiding colonel overruled. He said the general was qualified to assess the situation. He told Webb to answer. Marcus looked at the panel. He said Officer Holt had already decided what he was looking at. He decided in the first 3 seconds, the identification, the rank, the ribbons, the offer of verification. None of it was going to change a conclusion he had already reached, because the conclusion was not based on evidence. It was based on something he saw before I said a single word. Major Banks asked what it felt like to sit in that holding cell in that uniform. Marcus was quiet. For the first time in his testimony, there was a pause. The room waited. He said it felt like everything I had earned had been made invisible, not by the cell, by the man who put me there. The room absorbed that. Major Banks asked one final question. She asked if he had anything else he wanted the panel to understand. Marcus looked at the 5 officers across from him. He said the uniform means something. It has to mean something. Every person in this room has worn it. We have all accepted the weight of what it represents, the obligation, the standard, the commitment. And what that uniform means cannot be conditional on the color of the person wearing it. It has to mean the same thing whether the soldier is black or white or anything in between. Or none of us should be wearing one. He stepped down. The panel deliberated for 75 minutes. When they came back, the room was silent. The presiding colonel read the verdict. On the charge of disrespecting a superior commissioned officer in violation of UCMJ Article 89, guilty. On the charge of conduct unbecoming in violation of Article 133, guilty. Faust asked the panel to consider leniency given Holt's years of service. The presiding colonel looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "The sentence of this panel is as follows. Reduction in rank to E1. 6 months confinement in a military correctional facility. Forfeiture of all pay and allowances during that period. Dishonorable discharge from the United States Army Individual Ready Reserve." Faust said the sentence was excessive. The presiding colonel said Officer Holt disrespected one of the most decorated generals in the United States Army. He handcuffed a combat veteran who commanded thousands of soldiers in the field. He did so because he could not accept that the man in front of him had earned what he was wearing. He paused. "The uniform that Mr. Holt once wore demands better than this. This court is adjourned." Holt was escorted out by 2 MPs. A dishonorable discharge meant the end of his law enforcement certification. It meant the loss of his veteran's preference for future employment. It meant the end of any pension eligibility. Every door in every public safety field in the country had just closed. Marcus sat in the gallery and watched him go. He felt no satisfaction. Satisfaction would have suggested this was ever a fair exchange, that a verdict balanced the morning that justice had restored something that had been taken. It had not. The morning had happened. The handcuffs had been real. The cell had been real. The humiliation had been real. The verdict addressed accountability. It did not address what it felt like to sit on a concrete bench in the uniform you had spent 30 years earning and be treated like a criminal. Nothing would address that. I understood that. He picked up his cover, placed it on his head, stood and walked out. In the corridor, Cole fell into step beside him. They walked in silence for a while. Then Cole said, "It was the right call, sir." Marcus said it was the only call. They walked outside into the November morning, colder now than it had been in October. The sky gray and low and pressing. Marcus put on his gloves. He said, "Thank you, Captain, for everything." Cole said, "Thank you for not letting it go." He nodded once. And then he walked to his vehicle and drove back to the Pentagon. His attorney, Patricia Monroe, filed the civil suit 3 weeks after the court-martial verdict. Webby versus Holt Sloan Paulson and Loudoun County Sheriff's Department. The claims were false arrest, unlawful detention, deprivation of civil rights, under color of law, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of his Fourth Amendment rights. Damages sought $2 million. The county's insurance carrier called Patricia Monroe's office the following morning. They offered $175,000 to settle. Monroe told them to start the number over. She said her client had been handcuffed in uniform while on his way to brief the Secretary of Defense. She said $175,000 did not begin to address the weight of that morning. She said they would see them in federal court. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury was composed of 10 civilians, 7 women, 3 men, a range of ages and backgrounds that reflected the community in which the incident had occurred. They watched the gas station footage. They watched it more than once. They watched Webb calmly identify himself. They watched him offer verification. They watched the handcuffs go on. They heard from Marcus Webb's psychiatrist, Dr. Linda Raines, who testified about the lasting psychological effects of the incident. She described symptoms consistent with acute stress response. She described the particular weight of being disrespected in a context where you had spent a professional lifetime earning respect. She described the way the incident had changed how Marcus Webb moved through the world, the calculation he now performed every time he put on his uniform in public, the awareness that his rank and his service provided no guaranteed buffer against this particular kind of encounter. She said he survived 2 combat deployments without PTSD. He was given PTSD by a gas station in Virginia. The room was quiet. Command Sergeant Major Reginald Okafor testified on Marcus Webb's behalf. I was 60 years old, broad-shouldered, with a voice that carried without effort. He had served alongside Marcus in Fallujah. He said General Webb made decisions in that city that brought 40 soldiers home. He made calls under fire that I still think about. The discipline, the clarity, the commitment to the soldiers in his command. I have never served under a better officer. And he was put in a holding cell like a criminal because of what he looks like. Not because of anything he did, not because of anything he said, because of what he looks like. He looked at the jury. He said that is a disgrace to every uniform ever worn in service to this country. Holt's body camera played again. Men like you don't make, Lieutenant General. In the quieter room, with 10 jurors listening, it landed differently. It landed like what it was. The defense made the same arguments. Reasonable suspicion. Stolen valor as a real and legitimate concern. Good faith mistake. The footage destroyed the first argument. The body camera destroyed the second. The words, "men like you," destroyed the third. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned liable on all counts. Total damages $500,000. $175,000 from Holt, Sloan, and Paulson personally. $325,000 from Loudoun County. It was not the $2 million Patricia Monroe had asked for. But the message it sent was not measured in dollars. Holt filed for personal bankruptcy within 60 days of the verdict. He was already serving his military sentence. When he emerged, he would have no badge, no certification, no benefits, and a dishonorable discharge on every background check for the rest of his life. Sloan lost her law enforcement certification. She appealed. She lost the appeal. She resigned and moved out of state. Paulson resigned voluntarily. He left Virginia. He did not contest the judgment. The Loudoun County Sheriff's Department was placed under federal monitoring. New policies went into effect. Mandatory implicit bias training for every officer. Body camera footage made publicly available within 48 hours of any use of force incident. A civilian review board established with real subpoena power, the kind that could compel documents and testimony, not the kind that existed on paper and accomplished nothing. The sheriff who had held the press conference resigned 4 months after the verdict. And Marcus Webb took the $500,000 and established the Webb Foundation. Full scholarships to West Point and VMI for black students from underrepresented counties across Virginia. Students who showed the academic record and the commitment and who otherwise might not have had the path made clear for them. He named the first scholarship class after the 40 soldiers from Fallujah. All 40 names, because the weight of command meant carrying people with you, and he intended to carry them forward. He told reporters, "I am not going to spend another minute of my life on the man who put me in that cell. I am going to spend the next part of my career making sure that young men and women who look like me have every door open to them that was open to me." That is what justice looks like in practice. Not anger, not bitterness. Purpose. 2 years after the incident, Marcus Webb was promoted to general. 4 stars, one of a very small number of black officers in the history of the United States Army to reach that rank. The ceremony was at Fort Myer. The Secretary of Defense presided. Dominique Carter, now a captain, pinned the 4th star. The room was full. Afterward, Marcus drove himself home, the same route. Route 1 south out of Arlington, down through Fairfax County, past the familiar stretch of commercial buildings and gas stations and fast food places that made up the particular landscape of Northern Virginia commuting. He passed the Shell station. He did not stop, not out of fear, not out of anything that could be called avoidance. He passed it the way you pass a place that has become part of your history, acknowledging it without being held by it. It was there. He was here. Both things were true at the same time. Derek Holt completed his sentence. I emerged into a world that had moved on without him. No badge, no benefits, no future in any uniform of any kind. His name, when searched, returned a particular kind of record that closed conversations before they started. I was working private security at a commercial warehouse, a job that required standing for 8 hours and not asking questions. He had given a statement through his attorney after the verdict expressing regret and acknowledging that he had made a mistake. The statement used the word mistake 4 times. It did not use the word prejudice. It did not use the word race. It did not use the phrase men like you. The Shell station where it happened had a small laminated card taped inside the window near the register. A customer had put it there the week after the verdict, written in clear block letters on a piece of index card. It said Lieutenant General Marcus Webb stopped here. The uniform was real. The station's owner had looked at it, had thought about taking it down, had decided to leave it. It was still there. Justice did not erase the morning. It never does. You do not get to go back into a holding cell and unmake the hour. You do not get to return the handcuffs to the belt before they close. You do not get to restore the reflection in the partition glass to something that has not happened yet. The morning had happened. It was in Marcus Webb's body. It would always be in his body. But what had come from it? A foundation. A review board with teeth. A set of policies that meant something. A cadet at West Point from a county in Southern Virginia who would not have been there without a scholarship that bore a name. The pain had purpose. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything. 4 years after the incident, Marcus Webb stood at the front of a room at Fort Myer. Not on a stage, not behind a podium. I was standing where the officer presiding always stands at the head of the formation, looking out at a graduating class of new officers, young men and women in uniform, some nervous, some trying very hard not to show it. All of them at the beginning of something that would ask more of them than any of them fully understood yet. He had not prepared a speech. I was there to administer the oath of commission. He looked at their faces, every background, every color, every corner of this country. Young faces that reminded him in some configurations of photographs he carried. The unit in Fallujah, the class photograph from his own commissioning years ago now, which felt both very close and very far, depending on which part of him was doing the measuring. He thought about what he could say to them. He thought about what he had needed someone to say to him back when he was standing where they were standing, uncertain and committed at the same time in the way that only people at the beginning of something important ever are. He decided he did not need to say anything about his own story. They knew the story. Everyone in this room knew the story. What he needed to say was something more essential than that. He looked at them for a long moment, and then he said, "You will be doubted. Let me save you the surprise of that. At some point in some room, someone will look at you and decide that what you are wearing does not match what they expected, that your rank is too high, that your achievement is too significant, that something about the picture you present does not add up to their arithmetic." He paused. "When that happens, you will have a choice. Every single person who has ever worn this uniform has faced some version of that choice. And the choice is not about them. It was never about them. It is about what you decide your service means. It is about whether you let someone else's inability to see you clearly determine how clearly you see yourself." He looked at the 4 stars on his own shoulders. He said, "I was put in a holding cell for wearing this uniform. I am standing here today administering your oath of commission." He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "Raise your right hand." They raised their hands. He raised his. And in the clear, quiet room, surrounded by the faces of the next generation of soldiers, he spoke the words of the oath. The same words that had been spoken at every commissioning ceremony in the history of this army. Words that did not care about the color of the person saying them. Words that meant what they had always meant when the person saying them had earned the right to say them. He looked out at their faces as they repeated the words, and he thought not for the last time this is what it was all for. Not the verdict, not the promotion, not the headlines. These faces, these voices, this oath. This particular kind of morning full of possibility and weight in equal measure where someone is standing at the beginning of something and choosing to go forward anyway. He lowered his hand. They lowered theirs. He said dismissed. And in that room the uniform meant exactly what it was always supposed to mean. If this story moved you, if it said something you needed to hear today, consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear it too. And subscribe our channel for more stories like this one. Stories about dignity, about service, about the long, imperfect, necessary work of justice. Because the stories we tell about who we are shape who we are willing to become. And some stories need to be told. Endophile. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from the constant labor of being seen incorrectly. Marcus Webb had carried that exhaustion for most of his adult life. Not every day, not in every room, but enough. Enough that he had developed the same practiced resilience that most black professionals develop over the course of careers spent in environments where the bar for proving yourself sits at a different height depending on who you are. He had never spoken publicly about this before the incident at the Shell station. It was not a secret. It was simply something he had kept within the private architecture of his own experience, something he had processed quietly, filed away, refused to let define the forward motion of his career. He had always believed that the work would speak, that the record would speak, that 30 years and a chest full of ribbons would eventually make the calculations clear enough that the doubt would have no room left to stand. The morning at the Shell station had shown him something he had not fully understood before. The doubt does not respond to evidence. It predates evidence. It exists in the gap between what someone sees and what they are willing to believe is possible. And no amount of correct evidence, no ID, no badge number, no offered phone call to the Pentagon closes that gap from the outside. The gap closes only when the person looking decides to let it close. Holt had not decided that, and the 11 officers who had complaints filed against them before Holt had not decided that either. And the desk sergeant, who had defaulted to his officer's certainty instead of trusting his own observation, had not decided that either. The failure was not individual. It was accumulated. It was built over time from a series of small decisions to look the other way, to let it go, to trust the institution, to correct itself without the discomfort of anyone actually doing the correcting. Marcus Webb understood all of this. He had understood it for most of his career. What had changed on the morning of October 14th was not his understanding. What had changed was his position. I was no longer a colonel or a brigadier general navigating the politics of being the only one in a particular room who needed to think carefully about every word before he said it. I was a lieutenant general. He had the rank, the record, the standing, and the platform to make the morning mean something beyond the harm. He had chosen to use it. That choice, as much as anything else, was what the foundation was about. He had taken the settlement, and he had not spent it on comfort. He had spent it on access, because access was the thing that changed trajectories. Not speeches, not verdicts, not the particular justice of watching a man read a rank aloud in a voice that fractured under the weight of what he was reading. Access. The scholarship recipients received not only tuition, but mentorship, placement support, and the kind of introduction to networks that most people receive through family connections, and that most people without those connections never receive at all. He met with each class personally, not in a formal ceremony, in a room, around a table, with coffee. He told them what he told no one else, not the Fallujah story, not the decorated career. He told them about the gas station, about the concrete bench, about the fluorescent light and the clock on the wall. He told them because he believed that the most useful thing he could give them was not inspiration. Inspiration was easy to find and hard to sustain. What he could give them was preparation. He could tell them this will happen in some form, And here is how I sat through it, and here is what I did with it when I got out. And here is what I need you to understand about that. The sitting through it is not the defeat. The sitting through it is the proof that you are still here, that you have not let someone else's incapacity determine your capacity, that you are still moving forward into whatever room comes next. That was the gift he could give them, and he gave it every time. In the first year after the verdict, 42 separate police departments across Virginia and the surrounding states reached out to the Webb Foundation, requesting the implicit bias training curriculum that had been developed as part of the Loudoun County Consent Decree. He had not advertised the curriculum. He had not marketed it. Word had spread through the departments on its own, through the network of officers who had seen the footage, and who understood at a level they might not have been able to articulate that the morning at the Shell station was not an anomaly. It was a visibility, a moment when something that happened all the time was suddenly documented in multiple angles, and given the particular amplification that comes when the person it happens to has the rank and platform to refuse to let it disappear quietly. The curriculum had been developed by Dr. Linda Raines in partnership with a team of behavioral researchers and a group of veteran officers who had agreed to sit in rooms together and have uncomfortable conversations about the gap between training and practice. It was not comfortable. It was not designed to be comfortable. Comfort was not the goal. The goal was change. Small, measurable, documented, audited change. The kind that showed up in use of force complaint numbers, in the statistics around who got stopped and how often, in the data that told the story of a department's actual practice rather than its stated policy. In 3 years, the Loudoun County numbers moved. Not all the way. Progress is not a straight line. It never is. But they moved. And the numbers at the 12 departments that completed the full curriculum moved similarly. This was not nothing. This was, in fact, everything that the morning at the Shell station could be made into. Sergeant First Class Dominique Carter, who had become Captain Carter 2 years after the incident and who had remained Marcus Webb's aide through the promotions, was there the morning the 4th star was pinned. She had known from the moment she could not reach him on that Tuesday in October that something had gone deeply wrong. She had felt it in the way that people who work closely with someone for years develop a particular sensitivity to deviation from pattern. I was always reachable. He was never unreachable. The voicemail had been a wrong note in a song she had memorized completely. She had escalated immediately, not because she panicked, because she was thorough, because she had been trained by a man who understood that the moment you hesitate in the face of something that does not add up is the moment the situation gets away from you. At the pinning ceremony, when she stepped forward and placed the 4th star on his shoulder, she did not say anything ceremonial. She said, "It's about time, sir." He had laughed, which was, in its way, one of the more significant sounds of that particular morning, because it was the laugh of a man who has come through something and arrived on the other side still capable of that, still capable of laughing, still capable of warmth, still capable of the full range of human expression that difficulty tries to narrow and that the most resilient people refuse to give up. The Shell station changed ownership 18 months after the incident. The new owner, a man named Robert Ellison, who had grown up in Alexandria and whose father had served in Vietnam, kept the laminated card in the window. He had asked the previous owner about it. The previous owner had explained. Ellison had said, "Leave it up. Leave it up forever." On certain mornings people stopped, not to buy gas necessarily, just to look at the card, to read the 12 words on it. Belgian Marcus Webb stopped here. The uniform was real. Sometimes people took photographs. Sometimes they stood for a moment and said nothing. One morning, 6 months after the new ownership, a woman in Army uniform stopped. She was young, a first lieutenant on her way to Fort Myer from her home in Manassas. She pulled into the lot and looked at the card through the window and stood there for a moment in the same October light that had been falling on that lot on the morning it happened. Then she went inside and bought coffee and drove to Fort Myer and did her job, which is in the end what all of this was ever about. The oath that Marcus Webb administered to the graduating class at Fort Myer was the same oath he had taken himself more than 3 decades earlier. The words had not changed. "I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which I am about to enter. So help me God." I had said those words as a young second lieutenant in a room not unlike this one, surrounded by faces not unlike the faces he was looking at now. He had meant every word then. He still meant every word. The meaning had deepened over the years, the way the meaning of anything deepens when you have been asked to live it out in difficult places and difficult circumstances, and have found each time that you were willing to continue. That was the thing, not the ribbons, not the stars, not the record or the verdict or the foundation or the curriculum. The willingness to continue, to put on the uniform again the morning after the cell, to drive to the Pentagon again, to brief the Secretary of Defense, to do the work, to let the work be bigger than the harm, to let the meaning be larger than the moment, to stand in a room full of young faces and raise your right hand and say the words and mean them. That was the thing. He looked out at the graduating class. He saw them the way he always saw them, the way he had tried from the first day of every command to see the people under his leadership, not as functions or ranks or demographics, but as individuals with full lives and full capacities and full claims on what the uniform represented. He saw them, and he hoped that when they went out into the world in their uniforms, they would be seen. He could not guarantee it. No verdict could guarantee it. No curriculum, no foundation, no policy change could guarantee the moment in which one person looks at another and decides to see clearly. That moment lived in individual human beings, in individual decisions, in the willingness or the failure to close the gap between what you see and what you are willing to believe is possible. But he could stand here. He could administer this oath. He could tell them the truth about the gas station and the concrete bench and the fluorescent light and the clock on the wall. He could tell them, "I sat through it," I continued, "and now I am here," which meant by extension you can sit through whatever comes. You can continue, and you will arrive somewhere worth arriving. He looked at them one more time. He said dismissed, and they went out into the world, wearing the uniform, which was real, which had always been real, which would go on being real, worn by people who earned it long after every name and every story had been absorbed into the larger story of what this country was willing to become. If this story stayed with you, if something in it felt true and worth carrying forward, please subscribe our channel and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Because some stories do not just tell us what happened, they tell us what is possible, and the possible matters. Now more than ever, there are things that courts cannot restore. Marcus Webb knew this better than most people who go through the legal process come out knowing it. He had been in enough rooms where decisions were made to understand that a verdict is not a restoration. It is a reckoning. The difference matters. Restoration would mean the morning at the Shell station had not happened. It would mean Holt had never turned into the lot. It would mean no handcuffs, no booking, no fluorescent cell, no reflection in the partition glass of a general in custody. None of that was available. A reckoning means this happened, and here is what follows because it happened. Here is what Holt carries for the rest of his life. Here is what the department had to change. Here is what the county had to pay. Here is what the record now says permanently about what occurred on that Tuesday morning. A reckoning does not make the past different. It makes the future accountable to the past. That is not a small thing. Marcus had spent time in the months after the verdict, thinking carefully about what he owed to the people who had not had a 3-star general's platform when their versions of this morning had occurred, because it had occurred before. Not always this visibly, Not always with 4 witnesses and 3 phone cameras and a department body camera providing multiple angles of the same undeniable truth. But it had occurred. It occurred with regularity in the lives of black service members who did not have his rank, who were corpsmen or sergeants or warrant officers or simply civilians who had served and kept a uniform from a period of their lives that they were proud of, who had been questioned, doubted, accused, who had not had a JAG attorney on their side, or a court-martial proceeding to attend, or a civil lawsuit that attracted national media coverage, who had simply been through something, and then had to continue living their lives afterward with the weight of it sitting in them unnamed and unaddressed. I thought about them often. I had received letters. Hundreds of letters in the first year after the incident went public. From veterans. From service members still active. From family members of soldiers who had died and who had never had the chance to see something like this arrive at a reckoning. Some of the letters were angry, most of them were not. Most of them were something more complicated than anger. They were the letters of people who had needed to know that someone with the standing to push back had actually pushed back. Not in spite of the rank, not in spite of the record, but because of it. Because the argument implicit in the morning at the Shell station was that rank and record did not matter. That service did not matter. That 30 years of documented, decorated, audited achievement could be looked at and dismissed because the person wearing it did not fit a particular mental image. The counter-argument to that was not a speech. It was the foundation. It was the curriculum. It was the verdict. It was the scholarship recipient writing him at 2 a.m. from a dorm room at West Point to say that she had gotten through the worst week of her plebe year by thinking about the concrete bench and the fact that the man who had sat on it had not stopped moving forward. That was the counter-argument. That was the thing that responded to the gas station morning at a level deeper than law could reach. Patricia Munro had called him the day after the jury returned its verdict. She had said, "I want to be honest with you. 500,000 is not 2 million. We left money on the table. I think we should have asked for more." He had said, "Patricia, this was never about the number." She had said, I know it wasn't. But I want you to understand that by every legal measure the jury believed you and found them liable on every count. The number is a reflection of what juries do with damages. It is not a reflection of what happened to you." I had said, "I understand that. I also understand that $500,000 is going to fund 40 scholarships over the next decade. So I am reasonably satisfied with the outcome." She had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "You are a remarkable person, General Webb." He had said, "I'm someone who got very lucky in terms of having the platform to do something with this. Most people don't get that. I don't want to mistake my luck for virtue." She had said, "Can't it be both?" He had thought about that. He had said, "Maybe. Keep in touch, Patricia." And he had gone back to work. Captain Adrian Cole was promoted to Major 11 months after the hearing at Fort Myer. She transferred to a position at the Pentagon working on military justice reform, specifically in the area of ensuring that veterans and reservists in law enforcement understood their ongoing obligations under the UCMJ. She had written the training module herself, drawing on her experience from the Webb case and from a series of interviews with JAG officers who had dealt with similar jurisdictional overlaps in the past. The module was adopted by the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force within 2 years of its publication. It was not named after anyone. Cole had specifically requested that. She had said it doesn't need a name, it just needs to be used. She was right. Harold Greer retired from the Loudoun County Sheriff's Department 14 months after the incident. He had 22 years in. He was eligible. He did not make a statement when he left. He did not give interviews. He submitted his paperwork, cleared his desk, and drove home. His wife said he was different afterward. Not broken. Different. Quieter in a particular way. More likely to stop and think before speaking. She said it was as though something had shifted in how he processed what he observed. She said he had told her once, late at night when they were sitting on the porch, I knew from the moment I looked at those ribbons, and I went along with it anyway. I don't have a clean way to live with that, so I just have to live with it the other way." She had not known what to say. She had put her hand on his arm, and they had sat there in the dark and listened to the neighborhood. There are people in every story who do not get neat resolutions, who do not get verdicts or foundations or ceremonies, who simply have to carry what they chose and what they failed to choose and figure out how to continue being human on the other side of it. Harold Greer was that person in this story. He carried it. That was all there was to say about that. The first Webb Foundation scholarship recipient to commission as an officer was a young woman named Tamara Ellis from Buchanan County, Virginia, the daughter of a coal miner and a school teacher. She had grown up in a county where the military presence was significant and the opportunities were not. She had found the scholarship through a guidance counselor who had printed the application and placed it on her desk with a note that said, "This one is for you." She had applied. She had been selected. She had gone through West Point with the particular combination of difficulty and determination that Marcus Webb recognized from his own experience there. The night before her commissioning ceremony, she had written him a letter. She had said, "I know you get a lot of letters. I know you have a lot on your plate. But I needed to tell you that there was a moment in my second year when I was ready to stop, when the weight of it was more than I thought I could carry. And I thought about you in that holding cell. I thought about the fact that you sat there in a uniform that no one deserved to question, and you did not stop moving forward. And I thought if he can do that, I can do this." She had ended the letter by saying she hoped to serve with the same commitment, and that she was grateful. He had read the letter twice. He had written back, "I had said you did the work, Tamara. I just showed you that the work was worth doing. Now go do it." She had commissioned on a bright morning in May. Her parents had come from Buchanan County. Her father had not owned a suit, so he had borrowed one from his brother. It was slightly too large in the shoulders. He had not noticed or had not cared. He had cried when she received her commission. The good kind. The kind that comes when something you hoped for becomes something that is real. Marcus Webb was not at that ceremony, but he knew it had happened. Dominique Carter had sent him a photograph. Tamara in her uniform, her parents beside her, her father in the borrowed suit, all of them looking at the camera with the specific expression of people standing inside a moment they will remember for the rest of their lives. He had looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he had set it on the shelf beside the photograph of the 40 soldiers in Fallujah, because they belonged together, because that was the line he was drawing with his life. From that unit in that dusty street to this young woman in her commissioned uniform. The line of what service meant and what it was supposed to protect, and what it could make possible when the people who had benefited from it turned around and used it to open doors for the ones coming behind them. That was the line. He intended to keep drawing it for as long as he had the strength and the standing to do so. There is a version of this story that ends with the verdict, with Holt being led away, with the gavel falling, with the $500,000 number appearing on a screen in a federal courthouse. That version is satisfying. It has a clean shape. It gives the audience the release that justice is supposed to provide. But the longer version, the version that extends past the courtroom and into the ordinary days that follow extraordinary events, that version is less clean and more true. Because justice is not a destination, it is a direction. You do not arrive at justice and stop. You move toward it day by day through the accumulated work of ordinary people, making individually small decisions to see clearly, to speak up, to act on what they know rather than what is convenient. Marcus Webb understood this. He had understood it since Fallujah. The decisions that kept 40 soldiers alive were not one large decision. They were hundreds of small decisions made in real time under fire, each one building on the one before, each one informed by training and experience and judgment that had been developed over years of doing the work. Justice worked the same way. The morning at the Shell station had not been undone by the verdict, but the foundation was working. The curriculum was working. The Civilian Review Board with subpoena power was working. The scholarship recipients were working. Small decisions accumulating, moving in a direction. That was the story. Not the handcuffs and the cell, though those were real and mattered. Not the verdict and the dishonorable discharge, though those were also real and also mattered. The story was what came after, the direction that was chosen, the work that was done. The morning at Fort Myer, when a 4-star general stood in front of young officers and raised his right hand and said the same words he had said 30 years ago and meant them the same way. Still here, still serving, still moving forward. That was the story. That was the one worth telling. And if this story moved you today, if it gave you something to think about or something to feel, please subscribe our channel. Stories like this one take time to research, to write, to tell with the care they deserve. Your support makes that work possible, and the work is worth doing, because the stories we choose to tell us something essential about who we are and who we are still becoming. Thank you for listening. Marcus Webb still made his coffee by hand every morning. He still ground the beans slowly, the way his grandmother had taught him in the kitchen in Richmond. The kitchen that smelled like cornbread and possibility. He still stood at the counter while it brewed and looked at the photograph on the shelf. It had gained a neighbor now. The 40 soldiers from Fallujah stood beside Tamara Ellis and her family on the day of her commissioning. 2 photographs, 1 shelf, 1 line drawn across time. His morning routine had not changed. Pull-ups in the garage, sit-ups on the mat, the run through the pre-dawn neighborhood, the coffee, the mirror. 3 seconds. Not vanity, respect. I was 60 now. The silver in his hair had gone fully white. The lines in his face had deepened. His body, which had carried him through 30 years of service and 2 combat zones, still responded to the demands he placed on it, though perhaps not as immediately as it once had. I did not mind. He had long since stopped measuring himself against what he had been, and started measuring himself against what he was still choosing to do. That was, he had found a more useful metric. He put on his uniform, 4 stars on each shoulder now, the ribbons across his chest, the name tape. He straightened everything. He checked the mirror. 3 seconds. Then he picked up his briefcase and walked downstairs and out the front door into whatever morning was waiting. There was always a morning waiting. That was the one thing that never changed. No matter what the previous morning had asked of you, no matter what the afternoon and evening had required, no matter how much had been taken or how much had been given, there was always another morning. Always the alarm, always the decision to get up, always the choice renewed again to continue. He had made that choice every day for 30 years in the Army. He intended to keep making it, not because the work was finished. The work was never finished, but because the work was worth doing, and the morning was waiting, and somewhere out there in a dorm room at West Point and on a patrol in a country she had never seen before, she joined up, and in a briefing room at the Pentagon and in a high school in Buchanan County, Virginia, where a guidance counselor was printing out an application and writing a note that said, "This one is for you." Somewhere out there the line was continuing, being drawn by hands he had helped steady, toward something that was not finished. That was not going to be finished in his lifetime, but that was moving. That was absolutely, unmistakably, undeniably moving, in the direction of something worth arriving at. He got in his car. He pulled out of the driveway. He drove toward the Pentagon in the early morning light of a Tuesday in October, 2 years and a day after the morning at the Shell station. I did not stop for gas on Route 1. Not because he was afraid. Not because the memory was too sharp. Because he had plenty in the tank. I had always had plenty in the tank. That was what 30 years of building something larger than yourself will do for you. You find when you need it most that you have more than you thought you had, and you use it, and you keep going, and the morning keeps waiting, and you keep meeting it. That is the whole of it. That is all there ever is. The morning, and the decision, and the keeping on. He arrived at the Pentagon at 7:53, 7 minutes early. He badged through security, nodded to the guard on duty, and walked the familiar corridor toward the briefing suite. His footsteps made the same sound they always made on these floors. Measured. Deliberate. The sound of someone who knew where he was going and had earned the right to be going there. Captain Carter was already at the door with a folder. She handed it to him without a word. He opened it, scanned the first page, noted the change in the agenda order, and handed it back. He said, "Move the logistics piece to the end. Let the secretary ask his questions first. He'll want to drive the conversation." Carter made a note. She said, "Yes, sir. Anything else?" I thought for a moment. He said, "Coffee." She said, "Already inside." He said, "Good." He pushed open the door. The room was arranged the way he had asked for it. No hierarchical seating. Everyone around the table, regardless of rank. He had found over the years that the conversations were more useful when no one was performing for someone seated above them. The people in the room were some of the most experienced military minds in the country. They deserved to talk to each other, not to a hierarchy. I sat down. He looked at the faces around the table. He thought briefly of what it had taken to get to this chair. Then he set the thought aside. He opened his folder. He said, "Good morning, let's get to work." And they did, because that was what you did. You did the work. You did it in the morning, and you did it in the afternoon, and you did it on the days when everything felt possible, and you did it on the days when the concrete bench was still vivid in your memory. You did the work. That was the answer to everything. Not the only answer, but the one that was always available, the one that was always in your hands. Work, forward motion, the refusal to let the harm determine the direction. That was the answer. That was the story. And now it is yours. Do something useful with it. There is one more thing worth saying. It is about the card in the window of the Shell station. General Marcus Webb stopped here. The uniform was real. 12 words. The person who wrote them was a woman named Barbara Cousins. She was 63 years old. She had a son in the Army, a staff sergeant. He had been deployed 3 times. He had come home each time. She had driven past the Shell station the morning the story broke. She had pulled in. She had sat in her car for a while. Then she had gone inside and asked the owner for a piece of paper and a pen. She had written the 12 words. She had asked him if she could tape it in the window. He had said yes. She had driven home. She had called her son that night. He was stateside between deployments. She had not told him what she did. She had just asked him how he was. He had said, "I'm good, Mom. I'm good." She had said, "I know you are." She had wanted to tell him about the card, about what it meant to her, about the particular way it felt to be the mother of a man in uniform and to watch someone question the uniform. She had not told him. She had decided he did not need that weight. He carried enough. She had just said, "I love you. I'm proud of you." He had said, "I know, Mom. Love you too." They had stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes, talking about nothing in particular. Football, the weather, a dog that a neighbor had gotten. The kind of conversation that is really about something else. About "I am glad you exist." About "I am glad you are here." About "the uniform is real. The service is real. You are real. And I see you." That is what the card said. That is what it was always saying. To every person who drove past it. To every soldier who saw it. To every black service member who had ever been questioned and who drove Route 1 and happened to glance at a window. I see you. The uniform is real. You earned what you are wearing, and no one gets to take that from you. That is the end of the story. That is also the beginning of the next one.